This is the calm crime story of Ralph Scopo, the quiet union man from Queens who helped steer New York concrete from crowded job sites to secret meetings, and finally to a cold prison yard. No shouting, no jump scares, just steady tension, soft shadows, and the hidden cost of keeping a city running smooth. Before we begin, take a breath and relax your shoulders. You are welcome to comment where you are listening from and what time it is for you, so we can see where this concrete road is reaching tonight. Chapter 1: Concrete Beginnings in Queens. On Sunday mornings in Queens, the street outside the Scopo apartment was full of noises that never quite went away. Delivery trucks grumbled past, kids bounced balls off brick walls, and somewhere a radio tried to pick Cuz's song through a storm of static. Inside, the smell of garlic and tomatoes floated from the kitchen, promising a sauce that had started simmering before most of the neighborhood had even opened its eyes. Ralph sat on the stoop a few steps above the sidewalk, letting the stone cool his back through his shirt. He watched the older men shuffle by in their suits, hats tipped just so, shoes shine to a soft glow. Some of them had union jackets folded over an arm. Some had the kind of tan that came from job sites and not from beaches. The kids on the block did not need anyone to explain who deserved respect here. It was in the way drivers slowed down, the way conversations quieted when certain men paused to talk about the weather and the Yankees and anything but what they really controlled. Ralph was not a loud kid. He was the one who watched from the edge of games, listening more than talking, noticing which foreman got a nod, which uncle was always the one people called when a cousin needed work. The families in their part of Queens were tied together by church, blood, and the unspoken rule that whatever happened on the block stayed on the block. The grown-ups might call it tradition or loyalty. The kids translated it simply. Some names meant security, others did not. On Sundays, his mother set the table like a small ceremony. There was the good cloth, the heavy plates, the short glasses for wine that the kids were supposed to water down but sometimes did not. Cousins and neighbors drifted in and out all afternoon, bringing fresh bread, stories from Brooklyn, and updates from the union halls. Ralph learned the rhythm of those conversations long before he understood the details. The words contract and overtime floated between remarks about school grades and who was getting married next. Every so often there was laughter about someone having to pay a little to keep a job smooth. A small envelope, someone would say, and everyone else would smirk or roll their eyes. No one called it what it really was. At the kid table it sounded like another grown-up joke, something filed next to that mysterious adult world where bills got paid and jobs appeared. The city itself felt like a large uncle in the background, gruff but familiar. Ralph knew Manhattan only as a shining line on the horizon when he crossed certain streets. To him the world was still corners of Queens and pieces of Brooklyn where the language was a mixture of English and the old country words his grandparents clung to. Concrete buildings, modest row houses, and the constant hum of traffic formed the backdrop to his childhood. School was less concrete in his mind. The desks and chalkboards and tests felt temporary, fragile compared to the weight of the construction yards he passed on the way home. He watched men in hard hats move like a practiced crew, guiding wheelbarrows and mixers, shouting simple directions that made more sense to him than anything written in a textbook. At home his father would come in tired and dusted with fine grey from a job, but there was a quiet pride in the way he dropped his work boots by the door. As Ralph grew older, the teachers began talking about college and certificates and careers inside office buildings. He listened politely, but when he looked out the window and saw a cement truck wobbling past, drum turning slowly, he felt a different pull. He understood that truck. It mixed, it poured, it set. It did not ask his opinion about poetry. By his late teens, he had already decided that the classroom would not be the place where his life really began. He slipped more easily into conversations with uncles who worked construction and union men who visited the house than he ever did with guidance counselors. They spoke his dialect of hours, overtime, and job sites. They also spoke of loyalty in a very practical way. If you stuck with the right people, they stuck with you. Leaving school early was less a rebellion and more a quiet shrug. One day he simply did not go back. Instead, he followed an older cousin to a job site where the ground shook under the weight of machinery, and the air smelled of diesel, sweat, and wet stone. A foreman looked him over, raised an eyebrow at his skinny frame, and waved him toward a pile of rebar that needed moving. The first days were a blur of aching muscles and shouted instructions. Ralph learned how to dodge swinging loads, how to keep his feet steady on slick plywood, and how to read the mood of a crew by the way conversations rose or fell during breaks. He found that he liked the straight lines of freshly poured foundations, the neat rows of forms waiting to be filled. There was something satisfying about watching a hole in the ground slowly become the suggestion of a building. Over time he became familiar with the subtle choreography of the site. Who arrived first? Who walked around with a clipboard pretending not to notice everything? Who took calls on the payphone at the corner and returned with news that shifted the whole mood of the day? There were men who had never lifted a bag of cement in their life, yet seemed to decide which jobs went ahead and which stalled. Ralph studied them the way some kids studied ball players. One afternoon on a job in Brooklyn, a man in a careful overcoat stepped past the gate and greeted the foreman like an old friend. The man's shoes were too nice for the mud, but he walked through it anyway. Ralph watched the quiet exchange between them from a distance. No one shouted, no one argued. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, and when it was over the whole crew somehow understood that weekends were about to become busier and the paychecks a little fatter. Later, during break, one of the older workers sat beside Ralph on a stack of pallets. He nodded toward the office where the visitor and the foreman had spoken. "That is the union man," he said simply. "You want things to go right on a job, you know his name." Ralph nodded and tucked the information away. The introduction to the union world came in small steps. A casual invitation to attend a meeting. A suggestion that he could use a card in his pocket instead of just a timesheet. At first he sat in the back of halls that smelled of old smoke and coffee, listening to officers talk about benefits, grievances, and contracts. Soon he noticed that the same names turned up on every committee, every slate, every whispered conversation outside after the meetings. Ralph did not rush. He did what he always did. He watched, listened, and volunteered for the jobs no one else wanted. Counting ballots, collecting dues, delivering papers between the hall and the job sites. He became the kid who could be trusted to carry an envelope across town and not open it or lose it. That sort of reliability tended to be noticed. As the years passed, he also noticed how close the union men sat, with certain figures everyone understood belonged to the Colombo family, even if nobody said the title out loud. They shared tables at weddings, leaned together in restaurant booths, and met in back rooms after official meetings ended. To outsiders it might look suspicious. To the people living it, it looked like one extended family figuring out how to keep hundreds of workers employed and reasonably calm. Ralph began to feel the pull of responsibility. He was no longer just a laborer with sore shoulders. He was a man other workers came to with questions about overtime rules, benefit forms, and which jobs would be worth the commute. On some evenings he met with older union representatives at a small cafe on Northern Boulevard, where the coffee was strong and the owner knew to keep the refills coming without asking. At home his wife saw the change too. The envelopes he brought back were thicker, the suits he wore fit a little better each season. Their children grew up in an apartment that slowly filled with better furniture and schoolbooks stacked in corners. Ralph liked seeing the worry lines on his wife's face soften, even if it meant that his own sleep grew lighter with every new responsibility. One night, after a particularly long day of meetings and site visits, Ralph stood by the window looking over a half-finished building across the street. Steel bones reached toward the sky. Floodlights cast pale pools of brightness over stacked materials and idle mixers. He thought of the years ahead, of the jobs that would come through this neighborhood and others, of the men who would show up needing work and the foreman who would need labor peace. He told himself that his family would never have to wonder about the rent or whether there would be food on Sunday. The city might be rough, the politics might be confusing, but concrete at least, he understood. It was strong if mixed right, patient if left alone, unforgiving if handled carelessly. Ralph exhaled, feeling the weight of both opportunity and obligation settle around his shoulders like a jacket he had chosen. Somewhere within that mix of union rules, neighborhood loyalty, and quiet influence, he could see the outline of the life he was building. It looked as solid as any foundation he had ever helped pour. Chapter 2: The Union Man. By the time Ralph became a familiar face at the Cement and Concrete Workers' Council office, the receptionist no longer asked who he was there to see. She simply nodded toward the hallway lined with framed photographs and let him pass. Those pictures told a history of their own. Leaders in dark suits shaking hands at ribbon cuttings, smiling in front of newly opened bridges, housing projects, and schools built on top of the very material their members poured every day. Ralph's own office on Northern Boulevard was not grand. A desk with worn edges, a metal filing cabinet that stuck halfway open, and a coat rack that leaned to one side gave the room a slightly crooked charm. The most important items were small things: a phone that never stayed silent for long, a calendar crowded with job numbers, a stack of folders filled with grievances, proposals, and the occasional letter from some city official demanding clarification. On the desk stood 3 framed photographs. In Nen, his children were young, sitting on a beach with sand clinging to their legs and ice cream smears on their faces. In another, Ralph and his wife posed at a banquet, both a little uncomfortable in their formal clothes. The third picture showed a concrete pump silhouetted against a sunrise on some forgotten job, a reminder of where all this had started. Most mornings began the same way: coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous decade, a quick check of the messages left overnight by stewards and contractors, a review of which job sites had reported trouble and which had remained, as he liked to phrase it, uneventful. Ralph's quiet mission was simple: keep as many of those sites as possible in that uneventful column. The phone calls formed a kind of percussion line. A steward in Brooklyn complaining about a contractor trying to sneak non-union workers onto a pour, a contractor in Queens whining that crew members were dragging their feet, an official from another local asking for help smoothing out a jurisdiction dispute. Ralph listened, grunted, and asked short questions. Underneath the noise he looked for the same things: who was paying attention, who was falling behind on obligations, who needed a gentle reminder that certain agreements were not optional. The Concrete Club was never written on any letterhead, but by then it was as real as any official committee. When a big city job crossed a certain dollar threshold, everyone in the loop understood that it would not simply go to the lowest bidder. There was a quiet rotation of favoured contractors, companies who had proved willing to play by rules that did not appear in the public bid documents. In exchange for a cut of the contract, they enjoyed labour peace and a reassuring absence of costly delays. One afternoon, a nervous contractor sat across from Ralph, twisting his cap in his hands. His company had landed a large city contract, and now the calls had begun. There would be a meeting, he had been told, where numbers would be explained. The contractor had heard rumours about envelopes and unspoken percentages. He had also read, with interest, some of the recent headlines about reformers who wanted to sweep such practices away. Ralph kept his voice steady and almost bored as he laid out the expectations. A small percentage on top of the usual costs. A commitment to hire from specific companies for ready-mix and trucking. A promise not to bring in any surprise non-union labour. In return, his job would move without the mysterious slowdowns that could otherwise appear. Inspections would not drag on. Deliveries would arrive when scheduled. Workers, who were capable of being very passionate about safety when provoked, would find surprisingly little to protest. The contractor tried to protest that his margins were already thin. Ralph responded with a small shrug. His words were simple. The cost of doing business in this city had never been low. Pay it, and the job would finish on time. Refuse, and time itself would bend against him. There was no shouting, no slammed fists on the desk. That was not Ralph's style. He had learned long ago that a calm tone could communicate more than any threat. The contractor left, still twisting his cap, but he also left with a clear choice. Within a week, an envelope arrived, and a new name was quietly added to the list of contractors in good standing. On job sites, Ralph preferred to appear as the reasonable union official. He would arrive in a suit that had seen better days, tie slightly loosened, and walk the perimeter with a steward at his side. He inspected safety rails, asked about overtime, and joked with the workers about their favourite ball teams. Any outsider watching would see a man concerned with conditions and compliance, exactly what a labour leader should be. But underneath the polite questions, Ralph was always counting how many workers on each crew, which supplier names were painted on the trucks, whether the contractor seemed grateful, resentful, or a little too confident. If a crew was restless, he might spend extra time listening to their complaints, nodding sympathetically, promising to speak with the boss. Later, back at the office, that sympathy could turn into an informal note in a file that the boss might want to be more punctual with his envelopes. It was not all cynical calculation. Ralph genuinely believed that the workers deserved steady pay, safe conditions, and respect. He had been on the lower rungs himself, soaked in sweat under summer sun, fingers cracked from winter winds sneaking through gloves. When he banged a fist on a contractor's desk about back pay or unsafe scaffolding, the anger was real. But he also believed that without the structure he and others enforced, chaos and non-union outfits would swallow the city's work whole. At the intersections of those beliefs sat the Colombo family. Their interest was less in hard hats and more in percentages, but they understood the value of a man like Ralph. He could translate the messy, noisy world of construction into predictable streams of money. In return, he had backing when he needed it. If a contractor refused to cooperate, Ralph might first apply pressure with paperwork and scheduling. Only when that failed would other voices, speaking with colder patience, become involved. Evenings at Casa Storta, the Brooklyn restaurant that doubled as a social club, were where those worlds blended most clearly. Ralph might arrive at a corner table to find a capo already holding court, sharing a plate of pasta and a story about some long-resolved dispute. It was in those low-lit rooms that maps of upcoming city projects were discussed as if they were family heirlooms being divided. This bridge to that company. That government complex to another, Ralph's role was to keep the labour side lined up with those decisions. He took notes in his head, never on paper, committing to memory which contractor would call his office in a week, asking about recommended suppliers. It was a careful dance. Too much pressure and contractors might run to the authorities. Too little, and the stream of tribute would thin. Back at home, his family saw only part of this life. To them, he was the man who brought home paychecks and occasionally missed dinner because of a late meeting. His children knew he was important in the union. Their friends' parents sometimes asked with a little too much enthusiasm if he could help their cousins get onto a job. He tried to keep the darker edges of his work away from the dinner table, but in a city like New York, the news had a way of slipping under every door. Reports about organized crime, about families with names his kids recognized only as distant cousins or godfathers, flickered across the television. Ralph would snort softly at the dramatic music and the ominous narration. The reporters, he thought, never understood the difference between the loud stories and the quiet reality. It was less about smoky rooms full of shouting, and more about the steady shuffle of papers in offices like his own. Still, when he locked the office each night, taking an extra second to jiggle the handle and make sure the door was truly secure, he felt the weight of what he carried. The union relied on him to keep the jobs flowing. The family relied on him to keep the money flowing. His own family relied on him to keep the rent paid and the refrigerator full. On one particular evening, as the sun slipped behind the low skyline of Queens, Ralph paused on the sidewalk outside the council building. Cars crawled past, horns occasionally complaining just for the sake of it. Somewhere, a siren wailed. He looked at the windows of his office, now dark, and imagined all the invisible lines running from that room. Lines to job sites where workers would arrive before dawn. Lines to city offices where contracts sat on desks waiting to be stamped. Lines to back rooms where men discussed futures over espresso. He knew that every line carried a measure of risk. Investigators from the federal side were taking more interest in the way big city contracts seemed to land with the same comfortable circle of firms. Reform-minded politicians were starting to say brave things about breaking the old patterns. Newspapers were sniffing around the story of the concrete club, though they had not yet given it that name. Ralph breathed in the smell of exhaust and distant bakery ovens and let his shoulders rise and fall. He told himself that he understood this game better than the outsiders did. To them it was scandal and crime. To him it was a complicated machine holding up an even more complicated city. If the machine was noisy and leaked a little money, well, so did every other machine he had ever seen. Still, somewhere beneath his steady exterior, a quiet unease had begun to stir. Concrete could hold a building for generations, but even the best mix could crack if something underneath shifted. As he turned toward his car, heading home to another family dinner and another night of television news half-watched, Ralph had no way of knowing that the shift had already begun. Chapter 3: The Concrete Club. The first time Ralph walked into Casa Storta in Brooklyn, he noticed the ceiling before anything else. It sagged slightly in the middle, the way old buildings did after years of smoke and laughter and arguments rolling around inside. Someone had tried to brighten the place with a fresh coat of paint at some point, but the room still carried the patina of 1,000 long lunches. Tables were crowded with men who seemed to have nowhere better to be, yet somehow had a hand in everything important. Espresso cups clinked softly, card games flickered to life and faded. Waiters moved like stagehands, setting down plates of pasta and small dishes of olives with the efficiency of people who knew that conversations here were not to be interrupted unless someone ran out of coughing. Ralph had been coming here for years by the time he realized just how much these four walls contained. For him, Casa Storta was not a glamorous underworld hideout. It was a working conference room with better food. It was where he came after long days at the council office, to check in with men who cared less about union rules and more about the numbers hidden inside those rules. At a corner table, a Colombo family capo sat with an easy half-smile, like a man who had already heard the punchline to every joke in the room. Beside him, other figures leaned in, their voices low but steady. Ralph joined them, nodding greetings, taking his usual seat. To an outsider it would have looked like old friends sharing a meal. The conversation started with weather, as it always did. A comment about how cement crews suffered in summer heat and winter wind. A complaint about city traffic. Then, as if following an invisible script, someone would steer toward business. New contracts, upcoming city projects, rumors about which developers were planning office towers along the river and which neighborhoods were about to see new housing blocks rise. Blueprints existed somewhere in government offices, of course, but maps were drawn here as well, in the soft light above battered tablecloths. One of the older men tapped a knuckle on the table and spoke calmly about a large municipal project, a water treatment plant, a complex with foundations deep enough to swallow money by the truckload. The room turned a little quieter. Everyone knew what that meant. Ralph laid out the labor landscape, which locals had jurisdiction, which existing contracts could be used as pattern, which contractors were already part of the tight circle informally called the Concrete Club, and which were still hovering nervously outside of it. His words were technical, full of job numbers and union terms, but the meaning underneath was clear. If the project was to run smoothly, it would go through the club. That meant a familiar rotation of firms, each taking turns on big jobs as if it were a polite card game. In return for a small slice of each contract, the families would ensure that the job did not drown in slowdowns, strikes, and sudden safety crises. Ralph did not think of himself as a villain in a crime story. In his mind he was a problem solver. The city wanted projects built, contractors wanted profits, workers wanted steady pay. The system he helped maintain simply added one more line to the invoice and removed many lines of trouble. There were moments, though, when the quiet threat behind it all showed itself. On a chill morning in Queens, a new contractor arrived on a large site with big ambitions and a short memory. He had ignored subtle invitations to talk. He had not returned certain calls. He had convinced himself that the stories about tribute and special clubs applied to some other era, not to his bright modern company with glossy brochures and optimistic slogans. At first, nothing dramatic happened. Workers showed up. Forms were set. Trucks rolled in with their spinning drums. Ralph watched from a distance as the building's skeleton began to rise. He waited, giving the man space to reconsider. Then the delays arrived, the way fog creeps in rather than storms. A scheduled concrete pour was suddenly postponed because of a minor permit issue. A delivery went to the wrong entrance and spent half a day trapped in a traffic tangle. Inspectors took their time signing off on simple things, returning again and again with small questions. On site, the crew grew restless. Paychecks came late by just enough days to cause worry. Overtime approvals got locked in administrative limbo. Nothing was disastrous, everything was irritating. The contractor spent more time on the phone yelling than he did overseeing work. Eventually, exhausted and surrounded by half-finished columns, he rang the number everyone had suggested he might want to call from the beginning. The meeting in Ralph's office was as gentle as a business lecture. Ralph explained that this city was too big and too complicated for anyone to build alone. Good relationships made schedules shorter and headaches fewer. There was a well-established circle, he said, of companies who understood how things worked. They contributed a little, and in return the machine did not grind them up. The contractor, now noticeably less confident than he had been at the groundbreaking, asked how he could join that circle. Ralph responded with numbers in a level tone. A percentage here. Use of particular ready-mix and trucking firms there. A promise to respect union hiring practices. Within days, deliveries began arriving on time again. Inspectors smiled a little more. Workers found that their overtime slips were suddenly processed with lovely speed. The building rose and the contractor learned to sleep again. Back in Brooklyn, Casa Storta collected stories like that the way a bar collected bottle caps. Men recounted them with a mix of humor and relief. No one gloated too loudly. Today's anxious contractor could be tomorrow's valued partner. Better to let him keep his pride while quietly acknowledging that the real power had never left this room. What none of them knew, not at first, was that Casa Storta now had another guest. High above the tables, hidden among the uneven beams of the ceiling Ralph had noticed on his first visit, small government devices had been carefully tucked into place. Federal agents had watched the restaurant for months, stretching wires, adjusting microphones, whispering into their own radios as they tried to catch the room's pulse without being seen. Now, as espresso cooled and forks tapped on plates, quiet conversations about clubs and contracts and percentages traveled along those wires to a listening post miles away. In a cluttered office, agents hunched over tape machines. Reels spun patiently as voices filtered through statting. They had to learn the language of the room, the ways in which a simple phrase like taking care of a job could mean many things. Ralph's voice appeared often on those tapes. Calm, practical, full of site names and dollar ranges spoken without ever using the word dollar. He explained how big jobs were assigned, and why certain contractors always seemed to land on their feet. He discussed which suppliers were acceptable and which needed to be pushed aside. To him, these were routine discussions, the logistics of his work. To the agents listening, they were puzzle pieces. Each call, each restaurant meeting, each union office conference room became another part of a growing picture of the concrete club. On some nights, the agents sat in silence, letting the voices roll over them until names and inflections became familiar. On others, they leaned forward, recognizing that someone had just said something that would sound very interesting in a courtroom. So while Ralph moved from office to site to restaurant, making sure the concrete flowed through the city's veins, unseen ears were learning how those veins connected. Casa Storta, for years simply a crooked little house of food and talk, had become a kind of lecture hall where the inner workings of the concrete club were patiently explained, one cappuccino at a time. Ralph did not yet know his voice was being saved onto spools of tape and carefully labeled. He was too busy keeping jobs moving, keeping workers content, keeping contractors halfway grateful and halfway nervous. It never occurred to him that the ceiling above his favorite table might one day testify against him. Chapter 4: The City Starts Listening. Across the river in Manhattan, far from the clatter of cement trucks, another kind of grinding sound filled the air. Printers spat out reports. Copy machines hummed. Doors opened and closed in the offices where federal and city investigators were slowly assembling a case that reached into every borough. Rudy Giuliani, the United States Attorney for the Southern District, had the look of a man who had long ago traded sleep for briefings. His name would later become famous across the country, but at this point he was just another lawyer trying to put order to a stack of evidence that never seemed to stop growing. Around him, assistant prosecutors and investigators drank too much coffee and argued over details that would one day be debated again in front of a judge. On a wide table in a conference room, there was a map of New York City studded with colored pins. Red for major construction projects, blue for companies suspected of being part of the Concrete Club circle, green for union halls and offices, including the building on Northern Boulevard where Ralph kept his filing cabinets and family photos. Each time a new tape from Casa Storta or some other bugged location arrived, a clerk updated the chart. Names of contractors were scribbled next to job sites. Arrows were drawn between companies and union officials. Beside some names, notes were added. Likely Colombo, likely Genovese, talks a lot, hard to read. The agents listening to Ralph's voice had developed a certain reluctant respect for his clarity. He did not waste words. When he explained the club rules to a reluctant contractor, the tape almost organized itself. There was the job, the percentage, the promise of labor peace, the warning of delay. For prosecutors looking to prove an organized system of corruption, these conversations were like carefully labeled diagrams. It was not only the tapes that worried Ralph's friends at the Casa. Contractors too were beginning to talk. In another quiet office, far from the news cameras, an investigator sat across from a developer who looked like he had aged 10 years since the investigation began. This man had built half a dozen mid-sized towers in Manhattan and Queens, each facade poured with concrete supplied by the same small circle of firms. He had grown wealthy, but he had also grown tired of the constant drain of unspoken obligations. Now, facing the possibility of charges himself, he had decided that the machine could no longer be fed. He described meetings with union officials, phone calls that began politely and ended with unmistakable messages, envelopes that had to be handed over if he wanted his projects to ever get off the ground. The investigator did not rush him. He asked for dates, places, names. He gently nudged the man to be more specific each time he slipped into general complaints. The developer's voice shook at points, but each detail added weight to the growing case. Other contractors were less cooperative. Some insisted they had never paid a cent beyond what was required by law. Others admitted that they had been extras but claimed not to know where those extras had gone. A few stared across the table and quietly refused to say anything at all. The investigators understood. It was one thing to be angry about money. It was another to risk the sort of attention that came from openly accusing men like those who sat at the tables of Casa Storta. Even in a city full of brave speeches, there were limits. Still, slowly the wall of silence began to crumple in spots. One small contractor from Staten Island provided a detailed account of how his company had been pushed off a project when he tried to resist the rules. A supplier from the Bronx described a sudden drop in orders when he failed to send a certain holiday envelope. Their stories echoed what the tapes were already suggesting. In the union world, rumors swirled. Some stewards whispered that the feds were circling. Others insisted that this was just another wave of publicity, nothing the families had not seen before. Ralph tried to keep his focus on the day-to-day issues that had always defined his job. Workers needed raises. Job sites needed to stay safe. Contractors needed to be reminded of obligations. But even he could not ignore the shift in tone when he visited certain offices. A city official who had once chatted comfortably about projects and politics now kept conversations short and oddly formal. A banker who had always been available for a friendly lunch suddenly had no time in his calendar. At home, the television began to fill with stories about a bold new push against the commission, the ruling councils of the city's 5 major crime families. Reporters stood outside courthouses and restaurants, speaking breathlessly about tapes and witnesses and the possibility that the government might finally crack the old structure that had held since the middle of the 20th century. Ralph watched these reports with a mix of irritation and wary curiosity. The way the anchors described it, every person connected to a crime family spent their days in smoky rooms plotting drama. He knew that most days were far more tedious. They were spent in offices like his own, arguing over contract language and trying to keep project delays under control. The first real blow landed in the form of an indictment thicker than a phone book. It named bosses, underbosses, and various captains from several families. It also named union officials connected to the concrete club, including Ralph himself. The charges spoke of racketeering, extortion, and using labor influence to steer millions in contracts through a handful of favored firms. When Ralph's name hit the evening news, the phone at his house would not stop ringing. Some callers were family members, their voices quivering with fear and disbelief. Others were union colleagues, trying to sound calm as they asked if he had known this was coming. A few were old friends from the neighborhood, calling just to say that they had his back, even if no one was quite sure what that meant now. At the council office, the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Reporters loitered near the entrance, hoping to catch a quote or photograph. Some members came in just to shake his hand, as if he were already on his way out. Others avoided him, perhaps afraid of being seen as too close to a man whose face had joined the nightly parade of mugshots and archival photos of crime bosses. Ralph met with his lawyers, men whose suits were just a little sharper than his and whose expressions carried a well-practiced mix of sympathy and calculation. They went through the charges line by line, pausing to translate legal language into simple words. The lawyers warned him that the tapes from Casa Storta and other locations were strong evidence. They suggested that the government was looking to make an example. He listened, hands folded, expression neutral. Inside, he felt a complicated blend of anger and weary acceptance. He had always known that the game carried risk. You did not funnel that much money through quiet channels without attracting attention. Still, he found himself slightly surprised that the attention had become so focused, so organized, so determined. One of the first practical consequences was pressure for him to step down from his leadership role at the district council. Reform talk had been building for years, and the indictment gave reformers the perfect justification to demand a clean sweep. Local newspapers ran editorials calling for independent trustees to take over and scrub away decades of influence from people like Ralph. At a tense meeting in the Union Hall, surrounded by officers he had worked with for years, Ralph announced that he would resign from his position. The room was quiet, the air thick with unease. Some men looked genuinely sad. Others looked as if they were already calculating how the new order might benefit them. Ralph kept his remarks short. He spoke of wanting the council to focus on members, not on legal battles. He said he would fight the charges in court and let his lawyers worry about the rest. There was polite applause, brief and careful, as if the room were afraid to express too much emotion one way or another. After the meeting, Ralph walked through the corridors that had once felt like an extension of his own home. Bulletin boards still carried notices about safety trainings and holiday parties. The smell of burnt coffee and paper never changed. Yet everything felt slightly distant now, as if someone had picked up the building and shifted it a few inches to one side. He paused by a wall of photographs showing past leaders. Some were men he had admired, others he had quietly resented, but all had shared a belief that the Union was both shield and tool in a city that rarely gave anything away for free. He wondered which stories would be told about him in years to come. Would he be remembered as the man who brought steady work to many, or as another cautionary tale in a prosecutor's press conference? Outside, the city moved on without noticing his private moment. Buses sighed as they pulled away from stops. Kids shouted on the sidewalk. Somewhere downtown, lawyers were already preparing the next press release about the commission trial that would soon put his name on every front page again. Ralph stepped into the late afternoon light and closed the Union Hall door behind him, as a leader for the last time. The building remained, solid and unremarkable, ready for the next name on the letterhead. He walked toward his car feeling lighter in some ways, heavier in others, knowing that his real fight was no longer in the world of concrete and contracts. It would now be in a courtroom, under fluorescent lights, with his life poured into the stiff language of law. Chapter 5. Sentenced in Stone. The federal courthouse in Manhattan had a way of making everyone feel smaller. It was not the tall ceilings or the echo of footsteps down polished corridors. It was the sense that the building had seen every kind of story already and had grown tired of being impressed. On a grey morning, Ralph sat at the defense table in none of its larger courtrooms, a suit jacket hanging a little heavy on his shoulders. To his left and right were men whose faces had appeared in newspapers for years, men described in careful dramatic phrases as bosses and underbosses and captains of this family or that. The press called it the Commission trial, as if the city itself were finally putting its own shadow board of directors on the record. Ralph did not think of himself in those grand terms. To him he was still the union man, the labour specialist who had turned concrete into influence and influence into steady work. Yet here, under the gaze of a judge and a dozen jurors, he was another defendant in a long line, his name wrapped in the same thick legal language as the rest. The prosecution laid out its story like a construction plan. There were phases and sections and carefully labelled exhibits. Charts appeared on easels showing how the 5 big families of New York were supposed to have divided the city's concrete business like slices of a very expensive pie. Witnesses talked about meetings and envelopes and job assignments. Then came the tapes. From a small machine on the prosecution table, Ralph's voice filled the room in a tinny echo that made him sound both distant and uncomfortably close. The jurors leaned forward as a transcript appeared on screens before them. Ralph heard himself discussing contracts, percentages, and which firms would get which jobs. The words, taken by themselves, sounded colder than he remembered them. There was no trace of the long days on job sites, the smell of wet concrete, the arguments over safety and overtime. Only agreements and numbers. Only calm instructions about how to keep projects smooth as long as certain obligations were met. A government translator walked the jury through coded phrases. When someone spoke of helping a contractor, the translator said they often meant steering him into or out of the concrete club. When they joked about making sure a job did not get stuck in mud, they meant avoiding slowdowns, strikes, and inspections that might suddenly become complicated. Ralph watched the jurors' faces as his world was converted into a series of bullet points. Some looked annoyed, others intrigued. One or two wore a slightly lost expression, as if trying to decide whether this was a crime story, a labour dispute, or a particularly grim business seminar. Outside the courthouse, the media loved it. Cameras waited every morning at the entrance. Reporters practiced lines about the fall of the commission, about the end of an era, about how even men who once controlled the flow of cement to the city's tallest towers now had to stand when the judge entered. Ralph's family had to push past that crowd each day. His wife kept her eyes down, clutching her purse tightly. His children tried to look calm, but their stiff shoulders betrayed the strain. They listened as commentators repeated the same phrases night after night, painting their husband and father as a central piece of a grand criminal puzzle. In the courtroom, Ralph tried to tune out the drama. He focused instead on the details that mattered to a man who had spent his life managing schedules. Which witnesses were lined up that week, which days the judge seemed impatient, when the lawyers whispered and shuffled papers with more urgency than usual. The defense strategy was simple enough. Lawyers argued that the government had taken ordinary union practices and dressed them up as organized crime. They insisted that the concrete club was a prosecutor's invention, a catchy phrase thrown over the normal rough and tumble of negotiating big city contracts. They pointed out that thousands of workers had received fair pay and benefits under the very contracts now being scrutinized. They asked whether the government truly understood the realities of construction, where delays and overtime and informal negotiations were as common as dust and noise. But the tapes kept playing. Again and again, conversations from Casa Storta spilled into the courtroom. Calm voices discussed who would get the next major project, how much they would pay for that privilege, and which union figures would enforce the deal. Laughter from those long-ago afternoons now sounded sharp in the echoing air of the courtroom. Midway through the trial, Ralph's body decided it had heard enough. It began as a tightness in his chest, a feeling he had learned to ignore on stressful days. A little indigestion, he told himself, shifting in his chair. The prosecutor was speaking about a large city job, pointing to a chart where Ralph's name sat beside several companies. He tried to follow the thread, but the tightness grew sharper, turning into a grip that would not let go. His breathing went shallow. The words at the front of the room blurred. Ralph felt sweat break out along his hairline, cold despite the warm courtroom. He reached for a glass of water and found that his hand did not quite obey him. One of his lawyers noticed first. The man leaned in, spoke softly, then stood up quickly and signaled to the marshals. The judge's voice cut through the room, asking a question Ralph could not quite hear. Suddenly the trial was no longer about charts and tapes. It was about a defendant who looked as if he might simply fold over in his chair. An ambulance crew rushed him through the same doors reporters had been using all week. Cameras swung to capture the sight of the Union man on a stretcher, his face pale, oxygen mask pressed to his mouth. For once, the shouting was not about indictments. It was about whether he was going to make it through the day. At the hospital, bright lights and quick hands took over. Ralph floated in and out of awareness as doctors spoke in calm, practiced tones about tests and blockages and the state of his heart. He felt the pinch of needles, the tug of monitors stuck to his chest, the strange weight of being the center of attention for a group of people who did not care about unions or families, only about keeping his pulse steady. Somewhere outside his room, he knew that the case continued in the background of government offices. Files did not stop moving just because one man's heart had decided to protest. But for a short while, the noise receded. In those hazy hours, he thought about job sites in winter, about standing on frozen ground while men waited to hear whether a pour would go ahead or be called off. He thought about his children as little kids, laughing at the sight of concrete trucks, calling them giant drums on wheels. He thought about Casa Storta, about the hum of conversation under that sagging ceiling, never imagining that a hidden wire was tagging each word with a date and time. The doctors stabilized him. There was talk of surgery, of long-term care, of the risks of stress. Ralph listened, nodding, but there was a courtroom calling him back. He knew that if he stayed away too long, the government might spin his absence into another story about power and influence. The Union man trying to slip away, they would say. So perhaps sooner than the doctors would have liked, he returned to the courthouse. He walked more slowly now, each step measured. His suit felt looser, his face drawn. At the defense table he settled into his chair as if lowering himself into wet cement, gingerly, and with the knowledge that every motion would leave a mark. The judge asked a few polite questions about his condition. The prosecutor nodded, formally sympathetic, then opened another folder. The trial moved into its later stages. Closing arguments began. The government spoke of a city held hostage by a secret committee, its concrete business run for the benefit of a few powerful men. They described Ralph as the labor arm of that machine, the man who turned union rules into levers for extortion. The defense countered that the government had built a grand story out of overlapping relationships that had existed in New York for decades. They insisted that there was no formal commission, only a series of friendships and rivalries in a city where everyone knew everyone else. They tried to separate Ralph from the more notorious figures at the table, painting him as a hard-working union leader who had become tangled in a big case because the government needed impressive names. When the lawyers were finally done, the judge gave the jury careful instructions. The jurors filed out, taking with them the power to decide whether Ralph would spend his later years on job sites or in a cell. The wait that followed felt longer than any concrete cure time. Ralph sat with his lawyers, sipping water, trying to keep his mind from racing ahead to every possible outcome. At home, his family watched the news, hands clenched around cups of coffee gone cold. Reporters stood outside the courthouse, ready to announce history. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell into that special kind of silence that only exists when people are about to have their lives measured in years and decades. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict forms as if they were heavier than paper had any right to be. Guilty, the jury said, again and again as charges were read. Guilty on racketeering counts. Guilty on charges tied to the manipulation of concrete contracts and the use of union influence for criminal gain. Ralph felt the words settle around him like dust at a demolition site. The judge thanked the jurors. The lawyers began planning appeals even before sitting down. Reporters rushed out to deliver breathless summaries to the evening broadcasts. Sentencing would come later, at another hearing with its own rituals and speeches. For now, the verdict was enough. The commission, as the government defined it, had been convicted. The concrete club, once just a quiet understanding between men in suits and men in hard hats, had been given a place in official history. As marshals led him from the courtroom, Ralph glanced back once more at the empty jury box, the witness stand, the charts still leaning against the wall. It struck him that this room, with its wooden benches and scratchy microphones, had more power over his future than any union hall or restaurant had ever had. The concrete world outside still stood firm, buildings rooted in foundations he had helped control, but his own footing had changed. Whatever came next would be measured not by contracts signed or jobs completed, but by the length of a sentence stamped onto a court record. Chapter 6. The Doctor and the Heart. The surgeon who first read Ralph Scopo's chart did not care about the commission trial. He cared about numbers of a different kind: blood pressure readings, cholesterol levels, the percentage of blockage in arteries that were supposed to keep a human heart supplied with life. He had been on call that day when the emergency room paged him. Male patient, late middle age, chest pain, history of stress and heavy smoking, now tied up in a very public federal case. The last part came as an afterthought, murmured by a nurse who had recognized the name from the news. By the time the surgeon reached the room, Ralph was resting under a wash of soft beeps and blinking monitors. His face still carried the courtroom's fluorescent pallor. There was a guardedness in his eyes as the doctor approached, as if he expected every stranger to be another kind of interrogator. The surgeon introduced himself and began the standard questions. Where does it hurt? How long? Any history of heart trouble in the family? Ralph answered in short, dry remarks, a man accustomed to official forms. Yes, he had felt tightness before. No, he had not paid much attention. There had always been too much work to do. Tests followed, electrocardiograms tracing erratic lines, images showing narrowed passages where blood should have flowed freely. The surgeon frowned at the results. The heart had been carrying more weight than it should have for too long. Stress and years of long days had not been kind. He explained as gently as he could that surgery would be necessary. There were blockages to clear, bypasses to build, repairs to make if Ralph was to have a fair chance at seeing his grandchildren grow up. Ralph listened, eyes on the ceiling. He had faced threats of a different kind in his life, from job site accidents to legal risks. A scalpel felt oddly impersonal by comparison. Still, there was fear there, tucked behind the stoic nods. He agreed to the operation with the air of a man accepting another hard job that had to be done. Outside the room, the surgeon learned more about the phone calls that had already started to circle the hospital. Anxious relatives, lawyers wanting updates, people who did not give their names but spoke in low, careful tones, asking whether the patient would be well enough to return to court, and soon. Some calls carried the weight of unspoken expectation. Others carried the sharpened edge of those who saw the patient as a piece on a much larger board. The surgeon was not a man easily rattled, but he felt the pressure. He knew the patient on his table was important to people who were not accustomed to hearing the word no. At the same time, he also knew that prosecutors and agents saw this man as a key figure, whose testimony and presence mattered in a historic case. Both sides wanted him alive, but for very different reasons. In the quiet just before surgery, the doctor stood alone, looking at the plan drawn on a sheet at the foot of the bed. He took a slow breath, reminding himself that a heart was a heart. Muscle, vessels, valves. Politics could wait outside the operating room. Inside, the only loyalty that mattered was to the patient on the table. When Ralph was wheeled under the bright lights, the world narrowed. Anesthesia softened the edges of his awareness. Voices faded, replaced by a soft, enveloping dark. In that half state, memory surfaced with a clarity that real life rarely allowed. He was a boy again on a queen's stoop, watching men in suits stroll by with the easy confidence of people who knew where every job in the neighborhood was buried. He felt the rough edge of the stone under his palms, smelled the tomato sauce from his mother's kitchen. Then he was on a job site, younger and stronger, carrying forms and lugging buckets, the winter wind cutting through his jacket. He heard the shout of foremen, the clang of metal on metal, the deep rumble of trucks backing into place. The rhythm of that life had been simple: Show up, work hard, pay attention. Another scene rose up, this time at Casa Storta. The sagging ceiling overhead, the clink of cups, the low murmur of voices discussing contracts and percentages. He saw men leaning in, listening to him describe which firms would be invited into the next big pour. He had felt important there, a man whose word carried real weight. He had not once looked up to wonder whether someone, somewhere, was listening in with colder patience. Memory shifted again, his children at the beach, laughing as waves chased their ankles. His wife at the stove frowning at a sauce that refused to thicken. Family dinners loud with half a dozen conversations at once. All the reasons he had given himself to keep pushing, to keep making deals, to keep the machine moving even when the gears were grinding. Back in the real world, gloved hands moved with quiet precision. The surgeon and his team worked as if performing a complicated repair on a structure nowhere else could see. Blood was diverted and returned. Vessels were bypassed and reinforced. It was a kind of construction project in miniature, one that required a steadiness no crane operator could match. Between instructions and measurements, the doctor could not entirely escape the knowledge that forces beyond medicine were watching. He had seen the nervous glances of hospital administrators who had heard rumors about calls from both law enforcement and quieter, unlisted numbers. He knew there were people who expected this man to walk out of the hospital and back into a courtroom, alive enough to stand trial and strong enough to absorb whatever sentence came. But in the end, the operation was not about them. It was about making sure a human heart could still pump without seizing in fear every time its owner climbed a flight of stairs. Hours later, Ralph drifted back into consciousness in recovery. The world returned in fragments. The cool weight of an oxygen mask, the distant hiss of machines, the murmur of nurses moving through the ward. His chest ached with a deep, heavy soreness, but the crushing tightness from before was gone. He tried to raise a hand and felt the tug of lines and tubes. A nurse gently told him to rest, that the worst part was over, that the doctor was pleased. In the days that followed, the world narrowed to small goals. Sit up, take a few steps, eat something more solid than broth. His body, which had spent years pushing through long days without complaint, now demanded a slower pace. Each small victory came with a wave of exhaustion. The surgeon visited regularly, checking incisions, monitoring vital signs, reminding him that the heart did not recover overnight from years of neglect. He advised low stress, gentle exercise, changes in diet. He spoke as if this patient might have the luxury of retiring to a quiet house, somewhere far from the city and its demands. Ralph listened and nodded, grateful, but both men knew that such a peaceful future was unlikely. Court dates had already begun to seep back into the conversation. Prosecutors wanted to know when he would be fit to return. His lawyers visited with folders under their arms, speaking in hushed tones about motions and deadlines. Occasionally, when the surgeon walked past the waiting area, he caught snippets of conversation he wished he had not heard. Men with heavy expressions talking about how important it was that Ralph be back on his feet. Others muttering about what might happen if he were not. The doctor shook his head, reminding himself that his job ended at the hospital doors. For Ralph, the hospital stay offered an unexpected, if brief, pause in the noise of his life. From his bed he could see a slice of Manhattan skyline through the window. Towers rose in the distance, some of them built during the very years when the Concrete Club had quietly directed the flow of work. He wondered, not for the first time, whether it had all been worth it. The years of deals, the careful balancing act between union needs, family expectations, and the demands of men who never signed their names on official documents. He thought about workers who had fed their families on paychecks his contracts had made possible, and about contractors who had paid more than they ever wanted to for the privilege. Late night, when the ward had quieted and only the soft beeping of machines kept time, Ralph spoke to the room in a low voice. He admitted, if only to himself, that concrete had not been the only thing set in stone over the years. His choices had hardened into habits, and those habits into a life he could no longer step out of, no matter how much his body protested. In a nearby lounge, the surgeon sat with a cup of coffee, staring out at the same skyline from a different angle. He thought about his patient, about the odd mixture of sympathy and unease he felt. On one hand, Ralph was just another man with a bad heart and a family that worried. On the other, he was a figure whose name would end up in history books, an example in lectures about organized crime and government crackdowns. The doctor had done his part. He had kept the man alive. What others chose to do with that life was beyond his control. When Ralph was finally discharged, walking carefully down the corridor in a loose shirt and soft shoes, the air outside felt sharper than he remembered. The courtroom waited for him, sentence still to be handed down, the full weight of his choices not yet officially measured. He paused at the hospital entrance, hand resting for a moment on the cool metal of the doorframe. Behind him lay a place where people fought simply to keep bodies working. Ahead lay a world where people fought over money, power, and control of the city's foundations. His heart, rebuilt but still fragile, beat steadily in his chest. He took a slow breath and stepped forward, knowing that the next time he faced a judge, he would not be able to blame stress or bad arteries. The decisions to come would not be made in an operating room, but in a chamber where words and records, not scalpels, drew the deepest lines. Chapter 7. Sentenced in Stone. On the day of sentencing, the same courtroom that had listened to months of evidence felt strangely smaller. The air was heavier, the benches more crowded, as if the building itself knew that this was the part where stories stopped being theories and turned into numbers that could end a life in everything but name. Ralph sat at the defense table, hands folded, suit hanging looser than it had at the start of the trial. The recent surgery and the long months in court had carved lines into his face. He looked more like an exhausted foreman than the villain in the government script, but the script was no longer his to edit. The judge read through the case with the measured rhythm of someone walking a familiar route. There was talk of the commission, of the 5 families, of the concrete club that had quietly guided major projects through a very selective gate. The judge spoke of contracts, extortion, and how the city's foundations had become stepping stones for a criminal enterprise. When it came to Ralph, the judge's tone did not sharpen or soften. It remained carefully level, like a spirit level held against a wall to show that everything was properly aligned. The sentence, when it came, was described as a term long enough that no one seriously believed Ralph would ever leave custody alive. The exact number of years almost did not matter. What mattered was the look that passed over his family's faces. His wife's shoulders sagged, as if someone had quietly taken away the chair she had been leaning on. His children stared straight ahead, jaws clenched, refusing to let the cameras see tears. They had known this was likely, the lawyers had warned them, the newspapers had predicted it, but hearing the official words still felt like having the ground pulled out from under them. Ralph listened without flinching, though there was a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with his heart condition. He had lived his life in a world where everything could be negotiated. Hours, rates, which contractor landed which job. Now he was hearing a decision that allowed no bargaining at all. When the judge finished, there was a brief formal silence. Then the shuffle of movement as marshals stepped closer, as lawyers leaned in to murmur about appeals, as the audience shifted its attention to the next defendant waiting for his own turn under the hammer. Outside, the waiting press turned the sentences into headlines. The commission crushed. Concrete club bosses given virtual life terms. Reporters spoke about turning points and the end of an era. Viewers at home saw a quick image of Ralph being led from the courtroom, another piece in a collage of somber faces under courthouse lighting. Inside the Scopo home, the television went dark. No one wanted to hear the commentary. They already knew the story better than the anchor did. In the days that followed, the union world moved to adjust. With the sentencing of Ralph and other officials, pressure that had been building for years finally overflowed. Reformers who had once been treated like noisy idealists now had the wind at their backs. City officials and federal monitors began talking about trusteeship. Soon announcements were made. The leadership of the Concrete Workers' Council that Ralph had once guided stepped down. A court-appointed trustee arrived with a neat briefcase and the promise to clean house. To the members he looked less like a crusader and more like a mild accountant who had taken a wrong turn and wandered into a world of hard hats and colourful language. He brought new policies, stricter record-keeping, and a habit of asking questions that made old-timers look at their shoes. Pictures of past leaders came down from the walls. Some were boxed up and filed, others seemed to evaporate overnight, taken home by families who did not want their relatives to become decorations in someone else's morality play. Workers who had spent years relying on quiet understandings now found themselves dealing with official letters, formal audits and training sessions about ethics. Some welcomed the change. They were tired of envelopes and whispers. Others missed the days when phone call to someone like Ralph could fix a problem that might now bounce between 4 different government offices before anyone even acknowledged it existed. In the broader Colombo family, the vacuum left by Ralph's sentence had to be filled. Concrete did not stop pouring because man had traded his office for a cell. Someone had to manage the remaining pieces of the family's construction interests. Joseph, Ralph's son, stepped forward. He had grown up watching his father juggle union rules and street expectations. Now he assumed the role of capo, the man expected to keep certain crews in line and certain income streams on track. He was a different man from his father in some ways. A little sharper around the edges, a little more at home in a world where guns were as common as grievances. But he carried the same last name, and with it the same expectations. In the eyes of many, he was simply the next Scopo in line, poured from the same mould. On quiet nights, when the noise of the day had faded, Joseph visited his mother. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, the same kitchen where Sunday sauce had once bubbled while union men talked about bids and jobs. Now the conversations were more careful. He asked her how his father was holding up inside. She passed along what she had heard from lawyers and phone calls. Ralph was adjusting, she said. He was reading more, walking when he could, complaining less about food than she had expected. She smiled when she said this, a small, weary smile that did not reach her eyes. Joseph did not say aloud what they both knew, that his father would likely never sit at this table again, never lean back in the old chair that still carried the shape of his shoulders. Instead, he promised to visit more, to keep the family together, to make sure the Scopo name did not simply become a footnote in court records. Back in the council hall, the new trustee walked past the empty office where Ralph had once kept his stack of folders and family photos. The desk was cleared, the drawers nearly empty. Only a faint outline on the wall marked where a framed picture had hung for years. The trustee paused, hands in his pockets, eyes taking in the room. He had read the files, heard the stories, listened to the tapes. He knew what had happened in this office, how decisions made here had rippled across job sites and bank accounts. But now, to him, it was just another room in need of fresh paint, new locks, and a different kind of paperwork. The city outside kept growing. Cranes moved across the skyline, foundations for new projects were dug and framed and filled. Concrete trucks lined up at dawn, drums turning, sunlight glinting off wet stone. In none of those trucks, a driver turned up the radio as he waited at a red light. The newscaster mentioned the long sentences given to the former commission figures and their associates. The driver snorted and turned the volume down again. He had another load to deliver and a schedule to keep. For Ralph, the schedule had become very simple. Wake up, count the hours until lights out. Mark time in a place where days flowed into one another like cement into a form, slow and relentless. His life, once measured in contracts and deadlines, was now measured in counts and head checks. He had helped shape the way concrete moved through New York. Now his own future had hardened into something no one on the outside could easily chip away. Chapter 8: Concrete Walls. The federal penitentiary at Lewisburg was a long way, in every sense, from the job sites and union halls of New York. The fences were tall, the gates heavy, the routines carved into stone by repetition. For Ralph, arrival there marked the final settling of a life that had once stretched across boroughs and bargaining tables. He learned the new rules quickly, when to stand, when to sit, when to move down corridors in a slow, controlled line. In a strange way, it reminded him of a job site, only here the project was invisible, the work measured in survival rather than completed floors. His cell was small, functional, and indifferent to who he had been on the outside. The concrete walls did not care about the concrete club. The bunk did not know that he had once decided which contractors got the largest paws. This place reduced every man to the same narrow bed, the same thin mattress, the same shelf for a few personal items. Ralph established a routine. Mornings brought count, then breakfast in a communal hall where voices bounced off walls thick enough to hold in anything. After that there were assigned jobs. Some men worked in kitchens, some in maintenance, some in workshops. Ralph, older and still recovering from his heart troubles, was given lighter duty, small tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind just occupied enough not to drift too far. In the yard he walked slow circles with other inmates who had once been names in headlines. They discussed appeals, lawyers, and the maddening pace of the Bureau of Prisons paperwork. Sometimes they reminisced about the city, about restaurants long gone and corners that had once been theirs to control. There was a strange democracy in the yard. A man who had been a boss on the outside might stand in line behind someone who had never made a newspaper at all. Power shifted in subtle ways, shaped less by past titles and more by present alliances and temperaments. Ralph, with his calm manner and union habit of listening, found a place on the edges of those circles, neither a leader nor a nobody. Letters became lifelines. From Queens came thick envelopes written in his wife's careful hand. She filled pages with family news, small details about the neighborhood, updates on weddings and christenings, the health of relatives. She mostly avoided the subject of money, though Ralph could read between the lines when she mentioned a part-time job here or a cousin's help there. Joseph wrote in a more clipped style. He reported on business in very broad strokes, never trusting that paper was truly private. He hinted at meetings and arrangements, the sort of work he had inherited by virtue of his last name and his willingness to step into the spaces his father had left. Sometimes he laced in dark humour, blaming traffic for delays that everyone knew had nothing to do with cars. Ralph Jr., the other son, sent notes that wandered more. He wrote about local union politics, about efforts to keep influence in friendly hands, about the mix of fear and respect that still clung to the Scopo surname in certain halls. He also wrote about his own doubts, the tension between wanting a clean life and feeling the pull of expectations thicker than concrete. Ralph answered each letter as best he could. He wrote fatherly advice, bits of old Union wisdom, small jokes about prison food and the quirks of guards. He tried to sound steady. He tried not to let the loneliness seep through. News from the outside did not always come in ink. Sometimes it arrived in murmured conversations in the yard or at the card tables. The Colombo family, he heard, was sliding toward another internal war. Old disputes had surfaced, new rivalries had formed, and the long arm of law enforcement was not the only force reshaping alliances. Names he knew well floated through these stories. Men he had sat with at Casa Storta, sharing coffee and planning concrete jobs, were now said to be facing each other from opposite sides of a grim, silent divide. The streets of Brooklyn and Queens were no longer just routes for trucks and union organizers. They had become once again routes for messages of warning and acts of vengeance. One day, in the middle of a week that had otherwise been as plain as any other, Ralph was called to the office. The guard's expression gave nothing away. Inside, a counselor waited with a file in hand, eyes full of the kind of professional sympathy that never quite reached the heart. He told Ralph that there was news from home. Joseph had been unalived in Queens, the victim of an ambush tied to the Colombo family's internal war. The official words were dry, stripped of the chaos of the moment. A shooting, a street, a hospital that had not been able to undo the damage. Ralph sat very still. For a moment he felt as though he was back in the courtroom, hearing the verdict. Only this time, there would be no appeal, no motion, no sentence to be served and measured. This was final in a way that even life imprisonment could not imitate. Memories of his son flashed uninvited. Joseph as a boy chasing a ball down the hallway. Joseph as a teenager trying to look tough in a borrowed jacket. Joseph as a grown man, eyes full of determination and something harder, insisting that he could handle the responsibilities that came with their name. Ralph had known, deep down, that Joseph's path was dangerous. He had warned, gently and sometimes less gently, about the cost of the life he was stepping into, but he had also benefited from his son's willingness to carry weight that Ralph could no longer bear himself. The contradictions of that truth pressed down on him now with suffocating force. In the yard that afternoon, men who had once been rivals offered short, awkward phrases of condolence. In their world, such news was not rare, but it still carried a sting. They knew that the bars around them did not keep pain out. Letters from home turned darker in tone. His wife's handwriting wavered more. She wrote about funeral arrangements, about grandchildren trying to understand why their father was gone, about a neighborhood thick with whispers and police lights. She tried to sound strong, but grief leaked out between sentences like water through a cracked wall. Ralph replied with words that felt small. He wrote of faith, of holding the family together, of staying close to one another. He left unsaid the nagging thought that would not leave him alone, that the same world he had helped strengthen, the same web of influence and power and fear, had now pulled his own son under. His health began to slide. Maybe it was the stress, maybe the simple march of time, maybe the kind of slow erosion that prison life produced in men who had once thrived on movement and purpose. His heart, repaired but never entirely reliable, protested the strain. Doctors at the prison infirmary adjusted medications, ordered tests, offered careful instructions. They did not have the time or resources of the big city hospital where his earlier surgery had taken place, but they did what they could. Ralph found himself spending more time in a hospital ward inside the walls of Lewisburg, a strange echo of his earlier stay. The windows were smaller, the view limited to fences and narrow strips of sky. Instead of nurses bustling between many rooms, there were a few staff members juggling too many patients. He used the time to think, not that he had much choice. He thought about the union halls, about the workers whose lives had been shaped by contracts he had negotiated, both honest and otherwise. He thought about contractors who had grumbled and paid, about the way concrete had moved through the city in carefully controlled streams. He thought about Casa Storta and the bugs in its ceiling, about the tape reels that had captured his voice explaining the rules of a club that no one ever wrote down. He thought about the day his heart had squeezed in the courtroom, as if trying to warn him that some load could not be carried forever. Mostly, though, he thought about his family, about the wife who now lived surrounded by ghosts and memories, and about the son taken by the very violent currents that Ralph had once helped direct, about the other children and grandchildren who would grow up with a last name that opened certain doors and closed others just as firmly. One night, in the quiet hours when the infirmary lights had been dimmed, Ralph's breathing grew shallower. Nurses moved quickly, but not frantically. They had seen this arc many times before. A man came in strong, grew weaker, then reached the point where medicine and will could no longer keep the balance. There were no reporters at the bedside, no lawyers arguing on his behalf, no union petitions being signed in the hallway. There was just an aging man whose life had been tied to concrete, taking shorter and shorter breaths under institutional sheets. He slipped away with less drama than had attended almost anything else in his adult life. No sirens, no shouts, just a slow fading. In Queens, word spread through phone calls and quiet visits. Some in the neighborhood shook their heads and said it was the inevitable end for a man who had lived as he had. Others remembered him as the union official who had gotten their father's work when times were lean. The city, as always, kept moving. Cranes lifted, buildings rose, trucks rolled out before dawn. Workers on some sites might have heard a foreman mention the news in passing. They nodded, thoughtful for a moment, then went back to the tasks at hand. Concrete sets whether anyone is ready or not. So did the story of Ralph Scopo. Chapter 9. The Scopo name endures. Years slipped by and the name Scopo settled into that strange space where history, gossip, and daily life overlap. For some, it was a chapter in a true crime book. For others, it was the label on old union photos gathering dust in a back office. For a smaller circle, it was still the name on the mailbox, the name called out at dinner, the name children wrote on school forms without understand all that came with it. In New York's construction world, the aftershocks of the commission trial and the trusteeships did not erase everything at once. Old habits lingered, old alliances adapted, and in certain locals, whispers about who truly held influence continued to circulate. Ralph Jr., who had kept one foot in the union world even as legal pressures rose, found himself pulled deeper into the machinery his father had once run. There were articles, court documents, and reform reports suggesting that the Scopo family still held sway over parts of the concrete workers' locals long after the elder Ralph's conviction and death. Investigators and journalists wrote about patterns, about contracts that seemed to favor companies tied to familiar names, about union elections where certain candidates always seemed to appear with the right backing at the right moment. Then came a new round of attention, sparked not by some dramatic commission trial, but by the steady work of inspectors and internal probes. An official with close family ties to the Scopo line was pushed out of a cement workers' local leadership role, accused of maintaining the very kind of hidden control that past cases were supposed to have ended. The tabloids had fun with it. Headlines painted a picture of mob bloodlines and cement power, of a dynasty refusing to crumble even under government pressure. They loved the contrast between the city's shiny new skyline and the old names still lurking in the basements of its labor politics. For those carrying the Scopo name, the coverage was a fresh sting. Grandchildren who had known their grandfather only through faded photographs and a few carefully edited stories now saw his name and theirs plastered across stories about corruption and cleanup. Teachers and classmates who might never have heard of the commission trial suddenly had opinions about their family history. At home, the conversations were more complicated. Around a long dining table in Queens, several branches of the family gathered on a chilly evening. The food was familiar, the noise level comfortably high. Children argued over dessert, older relatives swapped stories about cousins and jobs. On the surface, it was any Italian-American family dinner in the city, but hanging over the table, as tangible as the smell of garlic and coffee, was the latest article about the union shake-up. A newspaper sat folded on a sideboard, its headline just visible enough to remind everyone what it said. One of Ralph's grandsons, named for him and now a grown man himself, broke the tension first. With a half-smile that did not quite hide his discomfort, he asked what it felt like to have the family treated as both legend and cautionary tale. An uncle snorted and said that at least the spelling of their name was now properly memorized by every reporter in town. Another relative added a joke about never getting bored at family reunions, since there were always fresh legal documents to discuss. The table laughed, but the laughter had a brittle edge. Slowly, more serious thoughts surfaced. An older cousin talked about the pride he had once felt when union members whispered that the Scopos still had juice, that certain doors opened because of who they were. Then he admitted that, as the years went by, the pride had narrowed into unease. Being the family everyone wanted on their side was not the same as being the family anyone wanted to be when the subpoenas arrived. A younger woman, who worked far from construction and law, said that for her the name was a story she had inherited without a vote. Professors asked about it. Friends made jokes about mob movies. Dates treated her like a character from a documentary. She had learned to answer questions with calm and a little sarcasm, but it wore on her. Over coffee, the conversation turned to the unions themselves. Some relatives defended the old ways, at least partly. They argued that without strong, sometimes aggressive leadership, the workers would have been crushed by developers and city bureaucracies. They remembered times when a call from someone like Ralph had meant the difference between a paycheck and a pink slip. Others countered that whatever good had been done came at too high a cost. The envelopes, the fear, the way jobs and contracts had been steered for the benefit of a narrow circle. They pointed to the reforms, to the newer union leaders who were trying to run clean operations under constant scrutiny. The city, they said, had changed. It was no longer the same game, and even if it were, they did not want their children playing it. A silence settled for a moment as everyone absorbed the weight of that argument. In the corner of the room, a young boy played with a toy cement truck, pushing it back and forth along the edge of a rug. The grown-ups watched him and exchanged a look that was part amusement, part worry. Names like concrete can last a long time. They can support structures, both good and bad. They can also weigh heavy on those asked to carry them. As the evening wound down, someone turned on the television. A show about urban development flickered onto the screen, full of gleaming high-rises and time-lapse shots of towers growing from bare ground. The narrator spoke about visionary architects and innovative engineers. There was no mention of unions, no nod to the under-the-table negotiations that had once decided whose trucks would roll onto those sites. The younger Scopo watched with a mixture of relief and irritation. On one hand, it was nice to see a version of New York where their family story did not cast a shadow. On the other, they knew that this clean narrative skipped over people like their grandfather, who had shaped the city in ways not easily recognized in glossy documentaries. Before they parted, an aunt suggested that the family should take control of its own story. Not to deny what had happened, but to tell it in full, with the human parts intact. The laughter, the fear, the bargains made at kitchen tables and not just in back rooms. Maybe, she said, it was better for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren to learn the truth from the people who had lived it, rather than from a reporter trying to squeeze everything into a few loud paragraphs. No one objectors. They all knew that history, like concrete, is easier to shape when it is still wet. Once it sets, chipping away at it can take generations. Chapter 10. City of Concrete, City of Ghosts. On a mild evening many years after the commission trial, after the trusteeships, after the articles about lingering influence, a man walked through Manhattan with the calm curiosity of someone seeing old things with new eyes. He was not a cop, not a mobster, not a journalist, just a New Yorker of the quieter kind, the sort who had lived long enough to remember stories told by uncles and grandparents about how the city really worked back when concrete and envelopes travelled side by side. He started near the river, where glass towers caught the last light of day and turned it into a soft glow. At street level, commuters hurried past in a blur of suits and backpacks, more concerned with subway schedules than with the foundations under their feet. As he walked, he traced an invisible map in his mind. Here, beneath this sleek office building, there had been long arguments about which concrete firm would pour the foundation. There, under that neatly landscaped plaza, meetings in Casa Storta had once decided which company would win the contract. He crossed a wide avenue where buses sighed at every stop and horns offered their usual commentary on city patience. Somewhere under the pavement lay pipes and cables and supports, whose installation had been greased by more than Dutch engineering know-how. If you listened very closely, he thought, you could almost hear the echo of those old negotiations, not in words, but in the rhythm of the city itself. A few blocks away, he stepped into a small cafe to meet an old contractor who had agreed to talk. The man waiting at the back table had shoulders gone soft with age, but eyes that still carried the wary scan of someone used to reading a room quickly. Over simple cups of coffee, they talked about the old days. The contractor spoke about the first time he had been invited to play by the Concrete Club's rules. He had been young then, proud of his company, convinced that low bids and quality work would be enough. Then the delays had started. Phone calls were not returned, deliveries were mysteriously rescheduled. Workers who had been cheerful grew restless and suddenly very concerned about safety. When he finally agreed to a meeting with union figures and others whose names he had heard whispered, he discovered that the city operated on 2 layers. One layer was made of blueprints and contracts filed with the government. The other was built of handshakes and quiet understandings. He admitted that, once he joined the inner circle, his life got easier in some ways. Jobs flowed more predictably. Labour disputes vanished as if by magic. He was never entirely comfortable with the extra payments, but he learned to treat them as part of the cost of doing business in that era. When asked about Ralph Scopo, the contractor paused. He remembered a man who spoke softly, who preferred calm explanations to loud threats. Ralph had walked through job sites with the eye of someone who actually understood how concrete behaved. He would point out small things, a badly placed form here, a sloppy joint there, showing that he cared about more than just the envelopes. At the same time, the contractor knew that behind that calm exterior was the weight of serious backing. If Ralph said a job would go smoothly, it did. If he hinted that things could get rough, no one doubted that trouble would arrive on schedule. "Do you think he was evil?" the New Yorker asked. The contractor shook his head slowly. He thought for a while, then said that evil was too simple a word for a man like that. Ralph, in his view, was a product of his neighborhood, his time, his city. He had tried to lift his family and his people using the tools that were handed to him, even when those tools cut as often as they built. They talked about the commission trial, about seeing familiar faces on the evening news, about the strange feeling of watching private meetings replayed in public through transcripts and tapes. The contractor admitted that when the sentences came down, part of him felt relief. The system had become too heavy, too greedy. Something had to give. Later, as reformers took charge and trustees stepped in, he found that he missed a little of the old predictability. Yes, there was less extortion. Yes, the rules were clearer and the paperwork heavier. But there were also more delays that no one seemed able to fix. Progress meetings multiplied, and everyone blamed someone else for every problem. The New Yorker left the cafe as the sky began to darken. Streetlights flickered on, painting the sidewalks in soft circles. He walked uptown, passing housing projects and schools, each one sitting on pylons and slabs whose stories stretched back decades. He thought about what had changed. The big families no longer held the same visible power. Many of the old restaurants and clubs were gone, replaced by chain stores and glass-fronted bars. The names that had once ruled the unions now lived mostly in file boxes and aging memory. But he also thought about what had not changed. People still tried to bend rules to their advantage. Deals still happened in the corners of rooms away from the microphones. Money still looked for quiet ways to route itself around obstacles. The methods had shifted. The players wore different suits. Yet the underlying dance between power, labor, and City Hall continued, as stubborn as ever. Near midnight he found himself on a small rise in a park, looking out at the skyline. Towers of concrete and steel reached into the dark, their windows lit like constellations in reverse. Somewhere among them stood buildings whose foundations had been poured under Ralph Scopo's watch. There was no marker, no plaque saying this skyscraper brought to you with help from the concrete club. The city did not work that way. Its history was buried in paperwork and whispered stories, not carved in stone for tourists to read. He imagined, for a moment, the ghosts of men like Ralph walking the streets below, not in some spooky sense, just as traces in the way things still worked, in the habits of older workers, in the cautious tone union officials used when certain topics came up, in the nervous jokes contractors made when bids on very large jobs were discussed. Then he thought of the new generation. Kids riding the subway with earbuds in, staring at screens as the train rattled under tunnels reinforced with concrete poured long before they were born. They might never hear the Scopo name, or if they did it would be a footnote in a lecture, a mention in a podcast about organized crime. For them, the city was simply there, as natural and permanent as the sky above it. They did not see the layers of negotiation, risk and compromise that had shaped every block. And perhaps that was fine. Perhaps the mark of a city slowly healing is that its most painful battles fade into the background hum. The New Yorker took one last look at the skyline and started toward the subway. Above him, office lights blinked off Van Bayat as night crews cleaned hallways and checked locks. Below him, concrete held firm, doing its silent work of carrying weight without complaint. Somewhere, far from courts and clubs and union halls, a family in Queens sat down to dinner. They shared stories about relatives they had never met, about a grandfather whose life had been complicated and flawed, and in many ways very human. They spoke his name without ceremony, part of the long chain that linked past to present. The city would keep growing, new buildings would rise, new leaders, honest and crooked, would take their turns steering its fortunes. But the tale of Ralph Scopo, union man, concrete club fixer, husband, father, inmate, would remain poured into its foundations, what of many stories hardened into the base of New York. Concrete remembers the shapes of its forms long after the wood is stripped away. Cities remember too, in quieter ways. In the end, Ralph's legacy was not just in the crimes written on court documents, nor only in the jobs he helped create or destroy. It was in the reminder that even the most solid structures are built by imperfect hands, guided by motives that are rarely pure. And like all such stories, his eventually settled into stillness. The trials ended. The appeals ran out. The headlines moved on. Yet when the city falls silent for a moment, in the thin hour before dawn, you can almost imagine hearing a faint echo from the past. The rumble of a cement truck, the low murmur of a union meeting, the careful, steady voice of a man explaining how to keep a job running smooth, and the heavy cost that comes when that smoothness is bought instead of earned. Then the traffic starts again, horns sound, and New York returns to its usual restless rhythm. The ghosts step back into the foundations, leaving the living to walk above them, unaware but supported all the same. Chapter 11. Waiting for the Hammer. Time moved differently after the verdict, and before the hammer of sentencing came down. It was neither the fast rush of trial days nor the slow crawl of prison time. It was something in between, a suspended season where Ralph woke each morning to the same question: how bad is it going to be? He was held in federal custody, in that drab halfway world of holding cells and narrow visiting rooms, close enough to the city to see its skyline in the distance on clear days. The place did not pretend to be anything other than temporary. Scuffed floors, beige walls, doors that opened and closed on a schedule that belonged to someone else. Ralph fell into a routine because routine was the only thing that kept the edges of his thoughts from fraying. Mornings began with count, then the shuffle to breakfast in a cafeteria that smelled faintly of metal trays and instant coffee. After that, time fractured into waiting. Waiting for meetings with lawyers, waiting for calls, waiting for news that was never as fresh or as helpful as he hoped. The other men held there were in similar orbits. Some waited for trial, some for sentencing, some for transfers to places with names that sounded distant and cold. They played cards, argued about sports, retold their cases like old war stories, and then fell quiet when reality pressed too hard. Ralph listened more than he spoke, just as he always had. He learned who was loud because it distracted them from fear, and who stayed quiet because they were measuring every words. He found a few men he could walk laps with in the small recreation area, circling the same patch of concrete again and again under a strip of pale sky. From that yard on certain days he could catch a glimpse of downtown Manhattan far off, the towers rising above the haze like something from a previous life. He knew that inside some of those buildings, contractors and lawyers were still arguing over jobs and contracts, the same kinds of arguments he had once controlled without thinking. It felt strange to know the game kept going without him. The lawyers visited often. They carried folders and notepads and tired expressions. They spoke about guidelines and precedent, about the difference between this count and that count, about the age factor and the health factor, and the possibility of mercy that might slip through a judge's careful language. Ralph sat at a metal table bolted to the floor, hands folded, back straight. He listened to the legal strategy the way he had once listened to project plans. In another life he had juggled schedules, suppliers, and weather forecasts. Now he juggled potential numbers of years, none of them small enough to be friendly. They talked about appealing the verdict, about challenging certain parts of the case, about arguing that the government had stretched the idea of a criminal enterprise too far. There were paths on paper, trails of procedure that could, in theory, lead to a better destination. But when Ralph looked into his lawyer's eyes, he saw the truth. The commission trial had been a showcase, and showcases did not end with light sentences. The government wanted a message carved deep enough that nobody could pretend to miss it. On visiting days, the air in the waiting room was thick with overlapping emotions. Families lined up on metal benches, hands full of paperwork, identification, and nervous energy. Guards called names, doors buzzed, and visitors filed into long rooms where conversations had to compete with the constant background hum. Ralph's wife came as often as she could. She walked in with her purse clutched tightly, dressed neatly, trying to bring a small dignity into a place designed to strip that away. When she sat down across from him, the room around them shrank. For a few minutes, the hard plastic chairs and noisy conversations disappeared. replaced by memories of their kitchen table, of Sunday dinners, of the small ordinary arguments that now seemed like luxuries. They talked about family first, how the grandchildren were doing in school, who had gotten sick and recovered, which cousin had managed to buy a small house, little pieces of normal life carefully stitched together. Only after they had taken that walk through ordinary news did they approach the larger shadow. She asked about sentencing, about what the lawyers were saying, about what it might mean in real years. Ralph did not lie, but he tried to soften edges. He spoke in terms of possibilities instead of certainties, even when the certainties pushed against the back of his mind like a heavy door. Sometimes his sons came. Joseph carried himself with a mix of anger and pride, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. He wanted to appear strong for his father, and he mostly managed it. They spoke about business in coded, careful language, hinting at duties assumed and expectations met. Ralph felt both grateful and uneasy with every such conversation. Ralph Jr. came too, his demeanour a little more reflective, a little less sure that the old ways could guide a new era. He talked about union meetings, about whispers that the past was not as past as the newspapers claimed, about people using the Scopo name as both shield and target. Ralph listened, absorbing the currents flowing around his family. He wanted to push them away from danger with both hands, but the walls around him turned that wish into something small and abstract. All he could do was speak, and hope his words still carried weight. At night, when the cell block quieted and the sounds reduced to distant coughs and the occasional clink of metal, Ralph lay on his bunk and took stock. He thought about how it had started: stoop, job sites, union halls, restaurants with sagging ceilings. He replayed key decisions in his head, as if changing them in memory might somehow nudge reality. The first time he took on the role of enforcer for the concrete club. The meeting where he agreed to rotate contracts among firms in that quiet circle. The moment he understood that law enforcement had begun to treat labour influence not just as rough politics, but as organised crime. Yet for all the replays, he did not indulge in too much regret theatre. Regret, like wet concrete, could drown a man if he stood still in it. He kept returning to one thought instead. He had tried to keep things moving: jobs, paychecks, projects. He had tried to shield workers from layoffs and chaos, even while taking a cut for people above him. Whether that intention mattered in the face of what the law called racketeering was now out of his hands. There were small mercies in that holding world. A guard who treated the older inmates with a touch of respect. A chaplain who walked the tiers with quiet eyes, offering conversation without pressure. A medical checkup that confirmed his patched-up heart was still ticking, if not happily then at least steadily. One afternoon, during a rare moment of sunlight streaming into the recreation area, an inmate about Ralph's age sat beside him on the bench. The man had been in and out of prisons for decades on very different kinds of charges, but the look in his eyes was familiar. He nudged Ralph gently and said that the worst part of waiting was not knowing which version of the future to prepare for. The shorter term that might leave a man still strong enough to start again, or the longer term that meant the world outside would become something watched from a great distance, like a movie. Ralph nodded. He was old enough and honest enough to know that he was not preparing for any fresh start. What he was preparing for was acceptance. Acceptance that his story had reached a point where the roads only led in one direction. As sentencing day crept closer, the letters from home grew denser. His wife wrote longer paragraphs, as if trying to wrap the whole family around him through ink and paper. She told him that no matter what the judge said, he was still her husband, still the father of her children, still the man who had made sure there was food on the table even in lean years. Those words landed deeper than any legal arguments. They reminded him that behind every headline, every indictment, every trial transcript, there were people who saw him not as symbol or cautionary tale, but as flesh and blood. The night before he was taken back to the courtroom for sentencing, Ralph lay awake longer than usual. The noises of the block faded to a dull hum. His thoughts wandered through the decades like someone walking the length of a long unfinished building. He thought of the foundations he had helped pour and the ones he had cracked. He thought of the choices that had mixed together to form the life now under judgment. He thought of a boy on a stoop watching men in suits pass by, and of how that boy had followed them without ever quite seeing the destination. Eventually, fatigue won over thought. He slept in short, uneasy stretches, the kind of sleep familiar to anyone waiting for a verdict, a surgery, a birth, an ending. Morning came as it always did, indifferent and mildly grey. Count, breakfast, the shuffle to be processed and moved to the van that would take him back to the courthouse. As he stepped into the vehicle, hands cuffed in front of him, Ralph felt oddly calm. The waiting season was almost over. Whatever number the judge said, whatever words wrapped around that number, would harden into his new reality. He exhaled, slow and steady, as the doors shut and the engine started. Concrete had always set hard around him. Now the rest of his life was about to do the same. Chapter 12. First Winter Inside. The first real winter at Lewisburg arrived not on a calendar but in the way the air in the corridors changed. It thinned and cooled, carrying a faint metallic chill that settled into bones. Outside, the sky pressed low and flat over the yard. Inside, the rhythms of prison life tightened as men pulled into themselves against the cold. Ralph had been there long enough by then to know the layout without thinking. The count points, the turns in the hallway where noise always swelled, the spots in the yard where you could catch a brief slice of sun when the clouds cooperated. He wore the standard layers, drab and utilitarian, nothing like the suits he had once worn to union meetings and courtrooms. Those suits had been a kind of armor. Here everyone wore the same thin shield. Age, habits, and reputation did the rest. The early weeks inside had been all adjustment, learning who controlled what. Not in the old union sense with charts and meeting schedules and quiet phone calls, but in the simple, immediate currency of respect. Who shared food, who kept to themselves, who tried to run the same games that had landed them there in the first place. Ralph had chosen a path in the middle. He was too old to join the louder dramas and too experienced to be pushed around. He moved with a steady, deliberate calm that most men recognized as the bearing of someone who had already led, already lost, and was not looking to prove anything. By the time winter settled in, he had a small circle of regular companions. An aging bookmaker who still thought in odds, a former union hand from another city, a quiet man who had been a driver for someone important and now preferred chess to conversation. They walked the yard together in slow loops, breath clouding the air, hands tucked into pockets. They talked about aches, about news from home, about the tiny bureaucratic victories that made up life inside, a transfer approved, a medical appointment finally scheduled, a new pair of shoes issued before the old ones fell apart. Sometimes, when the others drifted away, Ralph walked alone. The crunch of gravel under his shoes reminded him of early mornings on job sites, when frost still clung to steel and the workday had not yet unfolded. Only here there were no forms to strip, no trucks to line up, no coffee truck rolling in as the sun climbed. The work inside was quieter. A little time in the library, shelving books whose spines showed the wear of countless hands, occasional shifts cleaning common areas, pushing a mop down the same hall he walked every day. Tasks that did not tax his heart too much, but still gave his muscles a reason to remember they existed. Letters continued to arrive, each on a bridge over the walls. His wife described the way winters in Queens seemed longer without him, even though the weather had not changed. She wrote about holidays that felt emptier but still went on, because children needed rituals and families needed excuses to sit at the same table. She told him that Anne of the grandchildren had done a school project about New York history and had come home with a textbook that mentioned the commission trial in a few short sentences. The child had looked at the book, then at the old framed photo of Ralph in their living room, and asked quietly if that was the same man. "We told them yes," she wrote, "but we also told them more than the book did. We told them about who you were to us, not just who you were to the headlines." Those words warmed Ralph in a way the institutional heating never quite did. Sometimes he would sit in the library on his break, turning pages of newspapers that arrived a few days late. The world outside continued to twist and argue with itself. New scandals, new crackdowns, new mayors promising to clean up some corner of the city that stubbornly resisted being cleaned. Every so often an article would mention the old days of mob influence in construction, as if those days were a long-resolved era neatly boxed up. Ralph would read those lines and feel a faint pull of irritation. The reality had never been so tidy. It had been messy, human, full of compromises and arguments and exhausted men trying to keep jobs going. He knew better than to say that out loud. Inside, nostalgia had to be handled carefully. Too much and you sounded like a man who wanted the old rackets back. Too little and you sounded like someone denying his own past. There were other older inmates who remembered the same years from different angles, a former city inspector who had accepted envelopes until the envelopes stopped coming, a one-time developer who had believed he could skirt every rule without anyone noticing. When they spoke together in low voices at a library table or in a corner of the yard, it was like three veterans comparing maps of a battle that none of them had truly won. They did not glorify much. They mostly shook their heads and wondered how any of them had thought it would last forever. The winter days blurred into one another, morning count, breakfast, work detail, yard time when the weather allowed, evening locked behind the cell door, the corridor noise gradually softening until only the hum of the building remained. Ralph developed a habit of standing at his cell window just before lights out. The view was limited, mostly fences and a slice of sky, but on clear nights he could see stars. They looked oddly clean from inside the wire, as if distance had finally stripped them of city haze. He would rest his hands on the cold concrete and let his thoughts drift over the years. Not in self-pity, but in a kind of quiet inventory. He remembered a winter long ago when a major pour almost failed because a storm had moved in faster than expected. Temperatures had dropped, and the concrete in the forms had been in danger of freezing before it could cure. He had spent hours on the phone that night calling in heaters, tarps, extra crews. Somehow they had saved the job. The building still stood in the city, solid and unremarked upon by those who passed it every day. Now, standing in a cell, he could not save much of anything. Not his freedom, not his son, not the union he had once shepherded. He could only control his response to the small choices in front of him. Be bitter or be steady. Withdraw or remain quietly human in a place that tried to sand those edges down. In the mess hall he sometimes caught younger inmates looking at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. They had grown up on stories and movies about men like him, names from an earlier chapter of the city's underworld. To them he was almost a relic, something out of a documentary. One evening, a young man with restless eyes and too much energy slid his tray down beside Ralph and asked if the stories were true, about the concrete club, about deciding who built what, about envelopes and threats and job sites that rose or fell on a single phone call. Ralph chewed, swallowed, and considered his answer. He told the young man that there had been power, yes, and money, and fear. That there'd been nights when a single conversation changed the course of a project worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. But he also told him about the costs, about the constant pressure, the feeling that every phone could be bugged, the knowledge that one wrong alliance, one bad decision, could bring either an indictment or a bullet. He did not go into detail. He did not have to. The young man listened, nodded slowly, and then looked down at his own tray with a new seriousness. The glamour drained a little from his expression, replaced by something closer to understanding. Later, back in his cell, Ralph thought about that conversation. He realized that in a small way, he had done something his lawyers and prosecutors had both talked about from opposite sides. He had helped illustrate that the old life was not worth chasing. Not with speeches, but with the simple truth of where he was now. As winter deepened, his health wavered. There were good days when his breathing came easy and he could walk extra laps in the yard. There were bad days when climbing the stair to his tier felt like ascending a mountain with a sack of wet cement on his back. The prison medical staff adjusted his medications, checked his heart, reminded him to report any pain no matter how minor it seemed. He followed instructions with the stubborn practicality of a man who knew he could not bluff his body any longer. On a particularly cold night, snow began to fall outside the high windows. It dusted the yard, coating razor wire and concrete alike in a pale, temporary softness. For a few minutes everything looked almost gentle, Ralph stood at his window and watched the flakes swirl and settle. He thought about snow in the city, the way it piled up along curbs until trucks and plows turned it into dirty banks, the way job sites would grind to a halt while everyone waited to see how bad it would get, the way the sound of the city changed, horns muffled, footsteps quieter, voices closer. Here the snow did not change much. Fences still stood, doors still locked, counts still happened on schedule. But seeing the yard transformed even briefly reminded him that the world could still surprise him. The first winter inside did not end with any grand event. It simply thinned, the air softening, the light changing, the yard slowly trading patches of ice for muddy ruts. Ralph felt himself carried forward with it, one more season behind him, fewer ahead. The long sentence stretched out unchanged on paper, but time itself had its own way of shrinking and swelling around him. He walked into the early spring with a little more grey in his hair, a little more heaviness in his steps, and a strange clarity in his thoughts. Whatever else happened now, he had made a fragile peace with where he was. The city he had helped shape carried on without him, pouring new concrete over old stories. Inside the wire, he carried those stories in his own memory, turning them over gently like stones in a pocket, worn smooth by use.